Java Servlets and JSP. 2. How to structure a web application with MVC pattern, Model 1 pattern. Uses a JSP to handle both the request and response of the application. This pattern is sometimes adequate for web applications with limited processing requirements, but it's generally considered a bad practice. Model 2 pattern. This pattern separates the code into a model, a view, and a controller. It's also known as MVC pattern. Model consists of business objects like the user object, view, HTML pages and JSPs. Controller, servlets. It's easier to code and maintain. Usually the methods of data access classes like the UserDB class are used to read and write business objects like the user object to and from the data store. What is a servlet? Servlet is a Java class that extends the HTTP servlet class. It runs on the server and does the processing for the dynamic web pages of a web application. What is web.xml file? This file describes how the web application should be configured when it is deployed on a server. It's known as the deployment descriptor. It is always stored in the web.inf directory of the application. With the Servlet 3.0 specification and later, you can use the @web-servlet annotation to map the servlet to a URL pattern. What is a Java server page? JSP. A Java server page JSP consists of special Java tags such as expression language, EL, tags that are embedded within HTML code. EL tag begins with a $, analyze of the code, first page, index.html. The HTML file contains the tags that define the first page. H1 and P tags identify the text that's displayed above the form. Then, the form tags mark the beginning and end of the form. Within the form, the first input tag defines a hidden field that submits hard-coded data to the server. The next 3 input tags define the 3 text boxes that get data from the user and a button that submits the data to the server. These input tags use HTML5 to create 3 text boxes that have required values. All 3 text boxes use the name attribute to specify a name that the servlet can use to access the value that's stored in the text box. The 5th input tag is for a button that submits an HTTP request to the server. Since the form tag specifies an action attribute of email list, this form submits this data to the servlet named email list using the post method. The CSS, cascading style sheet, contains the formatting for the web pages. In this example, the web pages uses the CSS that's stored in a file named main.css, inside the subfolder styles. CSS provides a way to separate the formatting of the pages from the content of the pages. This servlet begins by overriding the doPost method. This method is executed when its URL receives an HTTP request that uses the post method. The doPost method accepts both a request and a response object from the web server. The first statement defines a string for a URL. Then, the second statement uses the getParameter method of the request object to get the parameter named action from the HTTP request. After this, the code checks whether the action is null. If so, this code sets the URL string to a value of join. Afterwards, this code uses an if-else statement to check the action variable to determine what action to perform. If the action variable is equal to a value of join, this code sets the URL string so it will display the index.html page. If the action variable is equal to add, this code processes the data that has been sent to the server. To do that, the first 3 statements within the else clause use the getParameter method of the request object to get the parameters from the HTTP request. Then, the servlet performs the required processing by using normal Java code. For example, it stores the data in a user object, and uses the insert method of the UserDB class to save the user object in the database. After that, this code sets the user object as an attribute of the request object so it's available to a JSP, and it sets the URL string to the JSP for the second page of the application, which is stored in a file named thanks.jsp. After the if-else statement finishes, the servlet can return HTML to the browser by forwarding the request and response objects to the specified URL. This URL is typically a JSP, but can also be an HTML page. In this figure, for example, The code can forward these objects to the HTML file for the first page of the application or the JSP for the second page of the application. Since this code controls the flow of the web application, this servlet is known as a controller in the MVC pattern. The servlet finishes by overriding the doGet method. The body of this method contains a single statement that calls the doPost method defined earlier in this servlet and passes it the request and response objects. As a result, the doGet method can be used to do the same processing as the doPost method. The web.xml file uses the servlet element to provide a name for the servlet presented in this figure. Then, it uses the servlet mapping element to map that name to a URL pattern that you can use to call the servlet. In addition, the web.xml file defines two welcome files, index.html and index.jsp. Then, if a browser specifies a URL that only includes a directory, the web server attempts to display one of the welcome pages for the application. In this figure, for example, the web server starts by attempting to display the index.html page. If this page doesn't exist in the directory, it attempts to display the index.jsp page. These settings are typical for a Java web application. This class is a Java bin. It follows the three rules that all Java bin must follow. 1. Java bin must contain a zero-argument constructor. 2. Java bin must contain get and set methods for all of the properties that need to be accessed by JSPs. 3. Java bin must implement the serializable or externalizable interface, the main benefit that you get from coding your business classes so they qualify as Java bins is that you can then use special JSP tags for working with the beans. Most of this code in this JSP file is HTML code. In fact, the only other code in this page is the 3 special JSP tags that are shaded. This makes JSPs easy to write if you know HTML. The 3 JSP tags shown in this figure are expression language, EL, tags, and they're easy to identify because they begin with a $sign followed by an opening brace, and they end with a closing brace. These tags work because the servlet email list servlet stored the user object as an attribute of the request object with a name of user. In addition, this works because the user object has getEmail, getFirstName, and getLastName methods that provide access to the data that's stored in the user object. Although it's possible to embed Java code in a JSP, that's generally considered a bad practice. Instead, it's considered a good practice to restructure the app to move the Java code into a servlet that forwards the request and response objects to the JSP. That way, the servlet does the processing, and the JSP provides the HTML for the user interface. With this approach, the JSP doesn't require any embedded Java code, only special JSP tags like the ones shown in this figure. When a JSP is requested for the first time, the JSP engine converts the JSP code into a servlet and compiles the servlet. Then, the JSP engine loads the servlet into the servlet engine, which runs it. Summary: the Model 1 pattern uses JSPs to handle all of the processing and presentation for the application. It's generally considered a bad practice. The Model 2 pattern, also known as the Model View Controller, MVC, pattern, uses business objects to define the model, HTML pages and JSPs to define the view, and servlets to act as the controller. The data for the business objects in a web application are stored in data stores like files and databases. This can be referred to as persistent data storage. To work with the data store, you typically use a data access class. An HTML file contains the tags that define the content of the web page, and a CSS, cascading style sheet, file contains the formatting for the web pages. A servlet is a special type of Java class that runs on the server and does the processing for the dynamic web pages of a web application. A web.xml file describes how a web application should be configured when it is deployed on a server. As a result, it's known as the deployment descriptor, DD. A Java bin, or bean, is a Java class that, 1. provides a zero-argument constructor, 2. provides get and set methods for all of its private instance variables, and 3. implements the serializable or externalizable interface. An enterprise Java bean, EJB, is similar in some ways to a regular Java bean. However, EJBs are more complex and difficult to code than Java beans and aren't necessary for most websites. Since Java beans are just Java classes, they are a type of plain old Java object, Bojo. A Java server page, JSP, consists of special Java tags such as expression language, EL, tags that are embedded within HTML code. An EL tag begins with a $sign,